This is the work of Robert Wilson. Stage director, lighting designer, furniture designer, architect, visual artist, actor, playwright, choreographer, sculptor, and overall impresario. I worked on a Robert Wilson production in 2011 called The Life and Death of Marina Abramovich that was created for Manchester International Festival. That was the first time I'd ever heard of Robert Wilson, and it was one of the greatest experiences of my life, pivotal for my interest in theatre. I had little interest in theatre before that besides reading plays. When I saw that performance, I thought, oh, this can be theatre. Wilson and Defoe returned to the next Manchester International Festival with a production of The Old Woman for the 2013 festival, and I was able to sit in rehearsals for the 2024 Jungle Book. At the time of Life and Death, I was working for the RIBA, and shortly after the production, I would participate in the 2011 edition of the European Architecture Students' Assembly. It was a life-changing summer that seemed to open up a wormhole to a new trajectory of my life that had changed from the beginning to the end of that summer. Tom Waits said of Robert Wilson, "I don't think anyone can meet Bob and come away from the experience and not be completely changed." It's difficult to understand an artist by just looking at the results of their work. People talk about Robert Wilson with great awe and reverence as a man with a mysterious vision. But that's not very helpful to an artist wanting to learn. You can't learn from an artist if you only stand in awe of them. That mystery has to be grounded in techniques. We have to talk about them as a person who makes things and talk about their approach to making. They have to become human again. Part of that involves contextualizing the person. So let's start early. Robert Wilson was born in Waco, Texas in 1941. Wilson described the Waco of his youth as a place of extremism that incites division, also as a conservative place of Seventh-day Adventists and Southern Baptists where one had to pray every day and confess their sins. He said, "I would come home from school, go to my room, and close my door and lock it. I was not interested in playing with the other kids in the neighborhood. I was perfectly content to be alone." From 1959 to 1962, Wilson studied business administration at the University of Texas. Then he moved to Brooklyn in 1963, where he studied architecture at the Pratt Institute and became ever more interested in the visual performing arts. I've always admired that Robert Wilson said, when he first arrived to New York City, that he saw the theatre and didn't like it. He saw the opera and didn't like it. And then he saw the ballet and quite liked it. He doesn't name anybody, but he's probably referring to the theatre of realism or psychological realism, and the idea of the theatre as an intellectual experience, and within the melodrama of tragedy that are in essence romantic in narrative, with actors that Wilson would consider moving in hurried time, with gestures that were literal in their expression, upon a stage that Wilson describes as decorative. Most of which could be said of opera, which would probably have been in the old 1883 Metropolitan Opera House, as the presently standing Met Opera wasn't built until 1966. But these were all things that Wilson did not find in ballet. Discounting cinema, which belongs to the 20th century, other than popular music, ballet is the art form that moved the furthest in the 20th century. In the 1960s, when Robert Wilson was in New York, he's in the epicenter of ballet at that time. The Ballets Russes are over, and George Balanchine, who was dancing with the Ballets Russes, is leading the New York City Ballet. In 1964, January 26th marks the last performance of the New York City Ballet at City Center, and the company dances on April 24th for the gala opening of the New York State Theatre, which is to become its new home. Balanchine, Martha Graham, Merce Cunningham, and John Cage. Wilson must have gravitated to the immersion of the New York dance scene. He met Martha Graham, and she gave him some advice when he expressed that he didn't know what he wanted to do. Martha Graham said, "If you worked long and hard enough, you'd find your purpose as an artist." Wilson's first events, as he calls them, were in 1964. Back in the 1960s, artists in New York were making work in alleyways, garages, gyms, churches, and other non-traditional spaces. What's now called Soho in New York was then a cast-iron back zone of New York City. That was an industrial area of factories and cast-iron buildings. It was the artists that moved in and renovated it into the fashionable district it is today. Andy Warhol's factory was just south of Soho. Wilson had already been doing the stage design for dance work as early as 1964, notably for Murray Lewis. In the early 1960s, Robert Wilson worked as an assistant within the office of the architect Philip Johnson. Johnson asked a few young artists, among them Wilson, as well as a former student of Martha Graham, to create events for the New York World's Fair 1964, Do Riglet and Tomorrow. In 1965, the piece was also shown as part of the spring dance recital at the New York Pratt Institute, where Wilson studied architecture. In this same year, when Robert Wilson was 27, he created his own theatre company on 147 Spring Street in Soho, named the Bird Hoffman School of Birds, named after his childhood teacher Bird Hoffman, who helped him overcome his stutter. Wilson had already staged Bird Woman, which featured a certain Raymond Andrews, who I'll mention again later. Robin Bertano, who was a performer and an office administrator with the company, said that the first office space was under Robert's bed, which had a built-in desk, a few file drawers, and a phone. In the beginning, they did everything in the Soho loft: workshops, making costumes, props, doing business. Their first show, The King of Spain, premiered on January 30th, 1969, at the now-defunct Anderson Theatre on 2nd Avenue. A year later, and their first international success, Deaf Man Glance, performed on December 15, 1970, at the Center for New Performing Arts, Iowa City. The earliest work in Robert Wilson's career that I found arresting, particularly to memory, was Deaf Man's Glance, inspired in part by Wilson's important friendship with a deaf boy named Raymond Andrews, who he adopted as his son. Given Wilson's training as a visual artist, it's no surprise that one of his specialities is stage imagery. In Deaf Man Glance, the importance of image is already evident. The play's characters are mute, and only the images allow us to understand the story. Wilson uses the power of imagery as a fully fledged language throughout his career. The mostly silent work was constructed of fantastical scenes composed purely of performed images. This was not performance that resulted in images, but images that essentially called for performance. One of the foremost advocates of surrealism, Louis Aragon, the French poet and writer, likely saw Robert Wilson's Deaf Man Glance either on April 22, 1971, at the Grand Théâtre de Nancy in Paris, because Aragon writes regarding attending the performance, "To get there, you have to go through the hell of Paris, the tumultuous Boulevard Sébastopol, and all of a sudden, one no longer needed, or hardly needed, his ears," implying that he saw it in Paris. What's often overlooked about this letter from Louis Aragon to André Breton is that André Breton was dead at this time. André Breton died around 4 years earlier, in September 1966. Aragon commences this letter with, "My dear André, it wasn't very likely I would ever write to you another letter. It's already been 40 years. I didn't do it with you living, and afterward. I remember my anger when a stranger brought me a letter for the dead Éluard, begging me to place it on his grave. That's not what I'm doing now for you. I write because I didn't write before." Aragon continued to describe a memory between himself and Breton. "All of a sudden, in the deepest seriousness, you continued, 'It's because we have become deaf that we think Paris is mute.' Well, that's precisely the miracle. The play they did was called Deaf Man Glance, my friend, but was it a play, and were they acting? Bob Wilson's piece, and I hope he forgives me for preferring the diminutive of his first name, Bob Wilson's piece, which comes to us from Iowa. The world of a deaf child opened up to us like a wordless mouth. For more than 4 hours we went to inhabit this universe, where, in the absence of words, of sounds, 60 people had no words except to move. I want to tell you right away, André, because even if those who invented this spectacle don't know it, They are playing it for you would have loved it as I did, to the point of madness. I never saw anything more beautiful in the world since I was born. Never, never has any play come anywhere near this one, because it is at once life awake and the life of closed eyes. The confusion between the everyday life and the life of each night. Reality mingles with dream, all that's inexplicable in the life of deaf man. Never as here, from a dark hole in the theatre, have I experienced the feeling, in confronting the spectacle of Robert Wilson, that if ever the world finally changes and ceases to be this hell one sees at the end of almost 4 hours on the stage, and it is the hell where is the slag pit of the mind, that if ever the world changes and men become like the dancer I spoke of, free, 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 it's through freedom man will have changed. Freedom, radiant freedom of the soul and the body. Louis Aragon, Letter to André Breton, signed June 2nd, 1971. Wilson's whole method of visual books perhaps comes directly from Deaf Man Glance. Wilson is known for pushing the boundaries of theatre, staging plays with extreme relationships to space and time. For example, The Life and Times of Joseph Stalin last 12 hours, and the performance of Car Mountain in 1972 was staged on a mountaintop across 7 hills and lasts for 7 days with over 700 participants. A few years later, after 1974's A Letter to Queen Victoria, when Einstein on the Beach premiered in 1976, Wilson was manifesting his own theatrical style visually as well as conceptually. In these early years, Wilson was asked if he was influenced by Japanese theatre. He replied that he knew nothing about it. It was a reasonable assumption, not only because of the style of Robert Wilson's work, but because of how Japanese theatre had already affected European and American theatre by that time. The designer, Adolphe Appia, revered the music of Wagner, but was revolted by the cluttered and fussy stage he saw at Bayreuth, which he thought of as the antithesis of the sublimity of the stage, of music. Rather than backdrops, Adolphe Appia created environments, enhanced by dramatic lighting effects made possible by the introduction of electricity. The more realistic the play, the more the stage needed separation from the audience. The auditorium required darkening, and the stage needed to be filled with accessories. Just as the new direction of 19th century drama of Ibsen and Chekhov required new set design, the new set designer found it necessary for new theatres and new acting techniques. To break away from the stale 19th century realism, they looked to the stylized artificial presentation of Far East dramatic performance. Japanese troupes would occasionally tour and were seen, therefore, in Europe. This resulted, however, in a kind of constructivism wherein the actor and writing were subservient to an almost mechanical scenic design. Susan Sontag said, "Experience is a way of thinking. A stage work is an organized piece of human experience, which the audience must, as far as possible, be allowed to share with the actors." Theatre of the West is the last stronghold of realism. That is, the idea of theatre as belonging to life and not to art. A few people from America and Europe wanted to go in the opposite direction. They would like to see a theatre that aims boldly at stylization and simplification, discarding the entirety of pretentious timbre of 19th century drama. That such a theatre exists, and had long existed in Japan, has been well known here for some time. But so far very few plays have been translated in such a way as to give the Western reader an idea of their literary value. It wasn't until around 12 years after he received these comments comparing his work to Japanese theatre that he actually visited Japan with his friend Susan Sontag, where he saw bunraku, kabuki, and no theatre. But it was no theatre that he held a special affinity with. The gestures weren't to illustrate the story, or the music, or the emotion of the character. They were idiomatic, they were pure movement. This again is like modern ballet. I've been fascinated by no drama for about 15 years, but I'd like to save exploring it for a future video on my favourite theatre director, Yukio Ninagawa. Wilson has said of his own work, "Everything I do is dance." Wilson's direction is polyrhythmic and multi-directional, in that the actors perform on distinctly independent lines across the stage. Wilson doesn't want theatre to be patronised by language, in both senses of the word. That it shouldn't be the foremost cerebral essence of what brings the theatre to life. The theatre shouldn't be merely dramatised text, and it shouldn't undermine the ways theatre can communicate by using every element of the theatre to translate the text into their own craft. Nothing else of the theatre should be doing the business of language but the language. But he also appreciates that Shakespeare is diminished if his language is abandoned, but not if the actors are. He doesn't want language to explain, otherwise it is explaining itself. All these attentions to imagery in Wilson's productions lead us to conclude that his theatre is an image theatre. His plays can be interpreted in an idiomatic language. This recalls watching a ballet, where the idiomatic language communicates to you. You intuitively comprehend the piece because the succession of images demonstrate the intention of the work. They don't explain themselves. Wilson himself says, "I do the movement before working on the text. Later, we will combine text and movement. I do the movement first to ensure it is strong enough to stand without words. Movement must have its own rhythm and structure. It should not follow the text. This can strengthen a text without illustrating it. What you hear and see are two different layers. When combined, they create another texture." Wilson's philosophy stems from the 20th century language crisis, highlighting the idea that language confines our thoughts within words, whereas thought itself is vivid and constantly moving. Although language allows us to conceptualize things, it can sometimes fail to represent what we truly mean. Wilson's work illustrates how language is elusive, often evading the reality or the meaning we wish to convey. Wilson doesn't lend his staging to the ego of language that text-based theatre supports. He disjoints it, decontextualizes it, discards it, discontinues it, collapses sentences into silence, dissolves it into sound, overlays it jammingly, turns it into ritual, turns it into absurdity. Wilson's audible layers consist of music concrete, using repetition to distance itself from naturalism. Music, though certainly expressive in itself, is often irrespective of action to attain a kind of objectivity. Paralinguistics, animal sounds, whelps, as well as unusual pitches and timbres of voice. Vocalization, often without context, a character or plot, in a way that makes the meaning of the words insignificant, except occasionally alluding to something about the work's subject matter. And, in a true John Cage sense of the word, silence. All the actors perform through wire-free microphones. Wilson's productions are sometimes dominated by music, with Einstein on the Beach and Adam's Passion, as well of course as his operas. This is certainly the case. Theatre, after all, is a place of hearing as well as seeing, and of his operas, Wilson has said, "If I go to the opera, I really want to hear the music. I close my eyes. So the challenge is to find how can I keep my eyes open, how what I see can help me hear music better." But let's look at how he opens his production to Gluck's opera Orpheus and Eurydice. I've had to speed this up for the purposes of this video, but whilst the music plays during this opening, we see a square incrementally becoming larger until it dominates the background of the stage. Both subtle and powerful. It commands your attention whilst hardly doing anything. And whilst it seems slow, if you close your eyes for a few seconds and reopen them, you realize you've missed something. The stage performs in harmony with the music. Robert Wilson is particularly recognized for his work with light. He is considered the greatest lighting artist of our time and remains the only major director to have been billed as a lighting designer. Wilson's aesthetic vision is architecture and light. Without light, there is no space. Robert Wilson uses the practical elements of theatre to architecturally design his performance environment. Not only set design, but more predominantly light, music, and sound alter our relationship to space. Robert Wilson manipulates space by manipulating light, music, and architectural design. Within that fabricated space, Wilson utilizes controlled or manipulated movement through that space. Not forgetting Wilson's collaborators, who, in their own fields, costume design for example, alter our relationship to that space. If done well, it becomes artificial space, with people moving abstractly through a canvas of light in abstract costumes. The treatment of characters is equally important. In an interview, when asked why his characters are always heavily made up, Wilson responded, "Makeup is to have the eyes. It captures the light better and focuses the audience's attention on the actor. In Western theatre, unlike in African or Asian theatre, we've forgotten how important the eyes are. They are a language in themselves." Wilson has remarked on occasion that the theatre of other directors is not natural time, but time sped up compared to real life. Most theatre tells you what to think. I allow space to think. He often lights individual objects, like in a museum or a gallery. Wilson dismembers his actors with light, accomplishes the erasure of shadows when needed, and at times illuminates an object or body as if from within. Wilson uses light as a surrogate for the emotion displaced by his actors. "The light in my productions is like an actor," Robert Wilson said in a 2006 interview. His use of light, architecture, and music in combination is very temporal, ephemeral, active in nature, which is ultimately dramatic. Of his theatre's three main elements, music, architecture, light, his actors walk through it as an outward expression of their own inwardness. The dialogue frequently is insignificant to character or narrative. Wilson's actors seem also devoid of motivation to act at all. Wilson's whole mise-en-scène might be a surrogate for the non-emotive actor. His set is influenced by Dadaism, Bauhaus, and German Expressionism, which creates outwardly the emotional landscape his non-emotive actors step into, almost walking through their own subjectivity. In his work after Einstein, perhaps discounting his operas, his set design, particularly in props and stage structures, has much of German Expressionism. Black Rider, Macbeth, The Old Woman, for example. Wilson said in a 1999 interview that his ideal theatre would be a silent movie and a radio play combined. In a sense, this also reflects his influence of Merce Cunningham and John Cage, as this reminds us of one of their 1965 collaborations, How to Pass, Kick, Fall and Run. His direction is often cubist, presenting varied perspectives and having actors perform together of distinct angles and isolated lines across the stage. The theatre director which Robert Wilson most considered to be his peer was the Italian stage director Giorgio Strehler, and Wilson paid homage to Giorgio Strehler's The Tempest in his staging of the same play. A stage is unlike any other space. I hate naturalism. To be on stage is something artificial, and if you try to act naturally, it seems artificial. But if you accepted it as something artificial, it becomes more natural. Frequently, Wilson's productions are thought of as slow, referring not only to the long duration of his productions, by comparison the 5 hours of Einstein is a short work, but his characteristically slowed down movement of the actors. Wilson sees ordinary theatre as hurried performance and not in natural time. Wilson not only says that he gives his audience time to think, but it may also be thought of as musical time, time presented as in music artificially and abstractly. Of this artificiality, Wilson says that directors should accept the artificiality of the theatre and not try to pretend a reality or a naturalism. Often I feel that what I'm seeing on stage is based on a lie, Wilson says. You know, an actor thinks he's being natural, but he's not. He's acting natural, and that is something that is artificial. The slowness of Wilson's work is perhaps most emphasized in his video portraits. Of his own abstract impressionism on audiences, Wilson says, "You are either interested in the ritualistic pictures, its verbal and musical convolutions, and its languorous sense of fantasy, or you are not." Wilson presents a kind of time dilation between the audience and the stage. Wilson says his role as an artist is to create, not to be a copy, reproduction, or reflection. To present, not represent. Wilson, like a choreographer, gives the actor the steps, but the actor, like a dancer, must fill those steps with form. Actors present rather than express. They are not ventriloquists of the theatre. Wilson gives the actors space for authenticity within the choreographed count, rehearsed so it becomes routine, irrespective of the music, so they don't respond to the melody. After all, they are walking through architecture and light. Whilst the music is heard contrapuntally to the sense of pace or plot of the scene's arc, in this sense, by avoiding literal expression of emotion, Wilson sidesteps melodrama, which often theatre falls into when utilising music. However, he understands the dramatic stage, and nevertheless, Wilson uses crescendos in his rhythm across his productions. Wilson's themes are not mediated by character, dialogue, plot, but by colour, imagery, gesture, movement, rhythm, sound, objects, garments, presented in variation, echo, inversion, and abstraction. As opposed to a theatre where the content is the meaning and a way of understanding the piece, together they operate as illusions, connected in constellation, but not in linear narrative. Illusions made overtly in objects or space, but without explicit reference. Yet, despite this abstractness and classical form, Wilson effaces the boundaries between high and popular culture. Sadly, we were deprived of the unmade theatrical collaboration between Robert Wilson and David Bowie.
These come from a series of 5 paintings that I did as a potential cover for an album called Outside, and this in fact was the one that I chose as the cover.
What happened to the album?
Not very much. It came out, and I think it was quite interesting. In fact, I'm supposed to be doing it as a theatre piece with Robert Wilson for the year 2000. So that's something that we're supposed to be meeting if either of us can find some kind of place where we're both in the same country at the same time.
Well, that would be right now, because he's in New York City.
Is he?
Yes.
I'd kill him for not phoning me.
Next slide.
Robert, wherever you are, contact me, will you?
This album was potentially the basis for an unmade work between the two. Theatre design shouldn't be decoration, it should be architectural. Wilson's composition for staging is also reminiscent of Byzantine and Proto-Renaissance painters. Wilson is a mannerist in the modern sense. Wilson's stage design in terms of positions often reminds me of Egyptian wall painting at times, the grouping, the geometry of angles and spaces. We can compare this with Nijinsky's 1912 ballet, L'après-midi d'enfant. Wilson has said that everything he does is Cézanne, perhaps referring to their shared interest in light and geometric structure, the acknowledgement of still life above all, and their shared willingness to experiment. Robert Wilson thinks in terms of form and structure. He's not looking at content and asking, where are we and what does it look like? Wilson explains, if you take a candelabra and put it on a table, that's one thing. But if you take a candelabra and put it on a rock, that's something else. And maybe it's easier to see the candelabra when it's on a rock than when it's on a table. There is a test which researchers in cognitive neuroscience and psychology call the VVIQ, Vividness of Visual Imagery Questionnaire. It's a test to suggest aphantasia, a condition where a person is unable to visualize mental images. One of these questions requests the participant to picture an apple in their mind. Then the researchers ask the participant, what color was the apple? One group of participants will envision only the conceptual idea of an apple, describing the apple based on their subjective familiarity, such as that it's sweet and juicy, or they might categorize it as food or fruit, or something that grows on trees or can be bought at a supermarket. Or maybe they think of its associations like picking apples or baking apple pie, but not a visual image of an apple. They don't see it. This is the group that likely has aphantasia. Another group will picture the apple in their minds and say that it was either red or green. But another group will say that the apple was blue or pink or rainbow-coloured. The difference between these two latter groups is that whilst one group tried to picture the apple from memory, the other acknowledged that this very real-looking apple was artificial and was able to be any colour they wanted. The result indicate that scientists, particularly those in the STEM fields, science, technology, engineering and mathematics, are more likely to have aphantasia. A study published in 2018 found that 40% of mathematics and scientists reported experiencing aphantasia, which is a higher prevalence than in the general population. Another study in 2020 found that individuals with aphantasia were more likely to pursue careers in science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. He says he usually starts with structure, and then once the structure is in place, he's freer to fill the form and let the form live. For Einstein on the Beach, Wilson wanted 3 visual themes: a train, a trial, and a spaceship. There is an additional field theme that occasionally overlays one of the other themes. Wilson decided the performance would have a duration of 4 hours, constructed of 4 acts with 5 connecting interludes called knee plays, which would open and close the production. The structure is as follows: knee play 1, act 1, train and trial. Knee play 2, act 2, field and train. Knee play 3, Act 3, Trial and Field. Knee play 4, Act 4, Train, Trial and Field. And closing with knee play 5. Wilson describes this structure of Einstein musically as theme and variation. Wilson has also remarked in an interview that despite its surreal or abstract impression, Einstein on the Beach follows a very classical structure. This is true. Apart from the lack of prologue, this sequence is the structural basis of ancient Greek tragedy. Wilson has also remarked in an interview that people thought Einstein was avant-garde, but it wasn't. It was very classical. Allusions are scattered about the production, which are only capable of being brought together in the spectator's mind after the performance. It's worthwhile noting that there are a lot of significant collaborators and institutions that work with Robert Wilson much more regularly than Philip Glass. There are actors, dramaturgs, costume designers, supporting institutions, too many to dive into a few names and not others, but the collaboration with Philip Glass feels to be both a landmark moment in Wilson's career and also a particularly interesting intersection of artistic disciplines. Traditionally, an opera would be billed as a composer's work. The librettist and everyone else would be subservient to the composer or the impresario that's producing it. Not only is Einstein a true collaboration, but a significant collaboration for the tradition of the form. Philip Glass and Robert Wilson met in 1973. Glass has said that he went to see The Life and Times of Joseph Stalin, and in the morning ended up in Wilson's rehearsal space in Manhattan. The pair got on immediately and decided they would meet every week for lunch. Within a few months, they began to work on a piece. When they started talking about a subject, Glass suggested Gandhi, but Wilson wasn't that interested. Glass would go on to create a Gandhi opera in 1979 as the second part of his Portrait trilogy, followed by Akhenaten in 1983. Wilson countered his idea with Hitler, which Glass didn't want to do. Then Wilson said, "What about Einstein?" That was it. Glass had already been very taken with Einstein, who was a kind of popular hero of the 1940s. What connected Wilson and Glass was how they thought about time and space in the theatre. Wilson explained the rising and turning beam of light as, the very start there is a vertical bar of light that appears 3 times. Then in the second scene, you have a horizontal bar of light. Together, they represent the cross of time and space, time shown as a vertical beam, space as a horizontal beam. Einstein on the Beach is an opera that's over 5 hours, featuring repetitive music with the libretto written by an autistic child, which concludes with a solo dance by its director. The original title was Einstein on the Beach on Wall Street, but Glass said he didn't comprehend the Wall Street part, so Wilson agreed to remove it. Unlike traditional operas, Einstein on the Beach has no conventional plot. Wilson and Glass created a non-linear structure composed of a series of tableaux that explores Einstein's life and ideas. Robert Wilson thinks with a pencil and paper. Wilson made some drawings and Glass composed the music to these, and then Robert began staging it. Wilson provided Glass with the visual ideas, which Glass would then respond to with musical compositions. These compositions were repetitive musical patterns and rhythmic structures, providing a hypnotic but meditative tone to the dreamlike work. Wilson explains that he always starts with a title, and then after determining the structure and duration of the proposed work, fills the architecture with form.
In my work, the whole stage is something like a mask. I work on the visual book first. I direct the work silently, so what I'm seeing is one thing. And then I work on the audio book after that, and I work on that separate.
The process of development is as follows. Stage 1. Preparation to gather ideas, information, themes, gestures, text, color, visual motif, language, word, lighting. Then meets with the collaborators, the dramaturg, costume designer, scenographer, composer, and others to discuss the mapping out of narrative content. The reason for the meeting is so nothing ends up incidental, and so, as Wilson says, they don't risk illustrating each other and are not dependent on each other. In this, he respects the autonomy and purity of the elements involved to maintain their freedom, autonomy, and individual strengths. Wilson doesn't think of the use of these elements of theatre as total art, but as a textured arrangement. Then, questions are asked to visualize the moments, much like dramaturgy. And from these sessions come his visual books, which are often accompanied by text on the side and beneath the drawing. Wilson's visual books are based on impressions and sensations from a dramaturg's retelling and descriptions of the work, yet they are imaginative compositions that think or see with the theatre and its mechanics, collage-esque, cut and paste. Wilson then visualizes the stage structure for each scene, and each scene must also have details of time, and these sketches are rough and often geometrical rather than pictorial. Figures indicate their relation to space rather than costume design, and the collaborators also begin their research and explorations. Stage 2. The first actor workshop lasts 2 or 3 weeks, in which a silent play is directed, no dialogue, only movement, and frequently music. This is to define and familiarize performance language in a routine manner. The actors learn their gestures like choreography, except that they are devoid of natural behavior and psychological expression. From this, the dialogue is noted and how long it should be inserted. Stage 3. The dialogue is inserted in the second workshop, and the dramaturg makes cuts and additions so the text can live inside these moments. Stage 4. Finally, the third workshop is the lighting. Peter Hall compared cinema and theatre by saying that cinema is more or less a literal space. A real person portrays another lifelike person and is placed in a literal setting and moves at familiar speed with familiar gestures. Theatre, meanwhile, is a metaphorical space of symbols. A real person stands on a stage which we imagine to be something and somewhere else. Also, cinema is essentially a two-dimensional experience. Anything viewed through a screen is the illusion of 3 dimensions, but it's presented in 2 dimensions, like a painting that has the same illusion. Whereas theatre is in 3 dimensions, in that sense, more like a sculpture. In the modern theatre, the natural space of the stage is darkness because modern theatres are mostly indoors. We throw light at it to be seen, but it's artificial light. Wilson embraces that everything we do with the stage is artificial and not natural, even down to the way a person walks, stands, or sits. The attitude to the stage is fitting to modern art, that embraced art was made of its tools and didn't try to hide its creative methods and materials, moving away from the illusion of real objects, people, or places. Wilson does something else that's very important, despite being minimalistic. He often fills the space. He frees the stage from the inevitable fate of one-point perspective, that everything has to be on the floor, with all this empty space above. More importantly, he does this without raising the floor level. Wilson's work are postmodernist because they are interdisciplinary. Not in the way that a performance might have a dance section and a spoken section, but that his actors are choreographed, and they may also sing, but not sing in songs. We must remember that in temporal experience, which performance is, it carries and grows in volume of a history that fills our memory. No piece is isolated. We constantly add up our impressions. Robert Wilson's canvas is fundamentally the proscenium arch. However, he has lately explored working with other stage types: an arena stage, a thrust stage, a theatre in the round, and a classical stage. His work is greatest, though, in a proscenium arch, in the darkened indoor theatre. The visual books he creates are most suited to this form, and the best seats for Wilson work tend to be those just above stage level but directly facing the stage, so you can see the stage as Wilson drew it and directed it. I think his work is best considered as a whole structurally. Performance is not just what we see and hear, but it's also temporal, building on previous images and information. He was asked in a 2017 interview, "How would you define the artistic avant-garde today?" And Wilson replied, "Rediscover the classics, to grasp the red thread that connects cultures that have never met, Egyptians, Mayans, Romans, Assyrians. This does not mean repeating previously used language, but rediscovering universal geometries, references that touch us deeply. I do not like recipes, but I can tell you what does not work. The update, as if setting Hamlet in a Los Angeles supermarket could make it more interesting. On the contrary, giving a specific reading of such a complex work would irreparably limit it. The true artist produces following a primordial instinct, to live it as a unique and relevant experience." I really enjoy to read these books on the history of live art forms, and Robert Wilson is a significant chapter in each of these independent histories. Robert Wilson has influenced every kind of live performance since he began working. He's the kind of artist that opens people's eyes and allows the artist to recall the freedom of another way. It's important that he trained as a designer because he allows artists to free themselves from being essentially designers. If something is working well, it's designed well. Anything humans designed is artificial, but we feel it to be natural because we're so familiar with it. Wilson allows us to be free of that headspace, to stop viewing things the way things are done as the appropriate way that something should be. Robert Wilson designed and founded in 1992 the Watermill Center on the site of a former Western Union communication research facility near Southampton, Long Island, about 2 hours from New York City. The Watermill Center is owned and operated by the Byrd Hoffman Watermill Foundation. The center serves as a laboratory for performance, and the Watermill Center fosters the research in the arts of the stage, providing young and emerging artists with a unique environment for creation and exploration in theatre and all its related art forms, and developing a strong global network that transcends age, experience, social, religious, and cultural backgrounds. The Watermill supports projects that integrate different genres and art forms, break with traditional forms of representation, and develop democratic and cross-cultural approaches. The Watermill offers a place for research, study, and inspiration, living and working together, and creating one's own environment and sharing these experiences with others. It's unfair to point to other directors whose specific work seems influenced by Robert Wilson. They're also influenced by other things. But there is a work that is what it is, because Robert Wilson's work demonstrated it's possible to go in that direction. Wilson's work opened up new pathways in presentation of theatre that people are excited to explore. He opened up a visual world for directors and audiences that was not thought possible. However, it must be said that it didn't come from nowhere. Many elements of Wilson's work existed prior to his work, but in disparate forms, and from philosophies and perspectives that differ. Much of Wilson's work had already been explored in ballet, but not in theatre. When we talk about Wilson's work as a theatre director, we forget to talk about that theatre was dragging behind the other arts. The arts that leapt forward the most in the 20th century were popular music and ballet. I'm hesitant to say visual art because much of it had already begun in the 19th century and exploded in the 20th century, and cinema doesn't have enough precedents to compare it to another century before the 20th. Robert Wilson's theatre is a theatre about theatre, a theatre that discusses the composition of theatre and asks, can this be theatre? Modern ballet and modern art took this direction too, and the music of the 1950s in particular. It was therefore the work of Merce Cunningham and John Cage that had a profound influence on Robert Wilson's work. You could easily say that each scene of Einstein on the beach is a separate ballet. Other theatre directors seem to have influenced Wilson's work also. We've already mentioned the design of Adolphe Appia, but also Edward Gordon Craig's view of the actor as a marionette, as well as Gertrude Stein's profound influence on his way of working with words. Wilson said in an interview, "I never studied theatre. If I studied theatre, I would not be making the theatre I'm making." Wilson deconstructs the contributing elements to theatre and questions each of them, their relationship to each other, how they form a textured arrangement rather than totality. He joked when giving advice for directors, "Discover what you're not supposed to do, and then do that."